I was standing on the curb with 2 black trash bags of clothes and exactly $14 to my name. My own family had just legally stolen my home. All they let me keep was a heavy, hideous painting. I thought my life was over. I was dead wrong. The pounding on the front door wasn't a standard, polite knock. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of authority. It was 8 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday in Seattle, and when I looked through the peephole, the sinking feeling in my stomach turned to lead. Standing on the porch was Deputy Miller of the King County Sheriff's Office, his brass badge catching the dull morning light. Beside him, holding a pristine leather briefcase and wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than my car, was my stepbrother, David Harrington. "Open up, Abigail." David's voice bled through the thick oak door, laced with that signature dripping condescension he had perfected over the years. "We have a court order. It's time." My hands shook as I unbolted the door. For the last 5 years, this house had been my entire world. When our grandmother Beatrice was diagnosed with early-onset dementia, David was off in London, building his commercial real estate empire and ignoring our phone calls. I had dropped out of my graphic design program, moved into the guest room, and became her full-time caregiver. I bathed her, fed her, held her hand through the night terrors, and loved her until her final breath 3 months ago. And my reward, a legal ambush. Through a shady maneuver orchestrated by David and a notoriously aggressive probate lawyer named Gordon Gable, they produced a revised will. It had allegedly been signed by Beatrice just weeks before she lost her cognitive faculties entirely. The legal jargon was a blur to me during the mediation, but the bottom line was painfully clear. The entire estate, including the $2 million home I was standing in, reverted exclusively to David. I was left with a generic clause stating I could keep personal effects of no monetary value. "You have exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises." Deputy Miller said, his voice flat, not unkind, but entirely detached. He handed me the official writ of restitution. "I suggest you gather your essentials." 15 minutes. I choked out, the reality finally suffocating me. "David, please, I just need a few days to find an apartment. I don't have anywhere to go." David stepped into the foyer, wiping his expensive Italian shoes on the welcome mat. He looked around the house, not with the grief of a grandson, but with the calculated gaze of an investor. "The market is hot, Abigail. I have a staging crew arriving at 9. You've had 3 months to prepare for this. I spent those 3 months fighting your fraudulent will in court, draining every cent of my savings." I yelled, tears of absolute frustration stinging my eyes. "And you lost?" David replied smoothly, checking his Rolex. 14 minutes. I ran upstairs. My chest heaved as I blindly threw clothes, my toothbrush, and my ancient laptop into a canvas duffel bag. I had $14 in my checking account. My credit cards were maxed out from the attorney fees. I was being thrown onto the street. As I walked back down the stairs, struggling under the weight of the bags, I stopped in the living room. Above the fireplace hung a massive 3x4-foot oil painting. It depicted a turbulent, stormy grey ocean crashing against jagged cliffs. The dark mahogany frame was chipped, and the canvas was yellowed with age. It wasn't signed, and it was undeniably ugly to most people, but Beatrice had loved it. She used to stare at it for hours, whispering that the ocean always hid its greatest treasures beneath the chaos. Without thinking, I walked over and pulled it off the wall. It was incredibly heavy, the wood dense and unyielding. David snorted from the doorway. "Really, you're taking that monstrosity. Mr. Gable had the estate appraiser look at it yesterday. He said it was amateur junk. But go ahead, take it. You're saving my contract as a trip to the local dump." I didn't say a word. I gripped the thick wooden frame, ignoring the splinter that pierced my palm, and walked out the front door. I didn't look back as the heavy deadbolt clicked shut behind me, severing me from the only home I had left. That night was a masterclass in despair. I parked my beat-up 2008 Honda Civic in a desolate 24-hour supercenter parking lot just off the highway. The Seattle rain drummed relentlessly on the metal roof. I huddled in the driver's seat under a thin fleece blanket, the cold seeping through the floorboards and into my bones. In the passenger seat, taking up entirely too much space, sat the heavy painting. The stormy waves on the canvas seemed to mock my current situation. I was 26 years old, utterly alone, homeless and freezing. As the windows fogged up with my breath, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and finally let out the sob I had been holding in all day. I cried until my throat was raw. I had nothing. 3 days passed in a blur of survival. By Friday, the reality of my situation had ground me down to a hollow shell. My $14 had been spent on cheap bread, peanut butter, and gas to keep the car's heater running in short bursts during the freezing nights. My back screamed in agony from sleeping contorted across the center console. I desperately needed a hot shower and a safe place to close my eyes before I completely lost my mind. I looked over at the passenger seat. The painting. David's appraiser had called it junk, but maybe he was wrong. Even if it was an amateur piece, the massive solid wood frame had to be worth something. If I could just get $50 for it, I could afford a cheap motel room for one night and a hot meal. I drove downtown to Pioneer Square, an area known for its cluster of high-end antique shops and obscure pawnbrokers. I lugged the heavy painting through the rain, the edges of the frame, digging into my bruised ribs, until I found a shop called Peterson's Antiquities. A bell jingled as I pushed the door open, surrounded by the smell of lemon polish, old books, and dust. Greg Peterson, a stout man with a jeweler's loop resting on his forehead, looked up from a display case. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyeing my disheveled appearance with clear suspicion. "I was hoping to sell this," I said, my voice hoarse. I hoisted the heavy painting onto his counter, careful not to knock over any porcelain figurines. Mr. Peterson pulled the loop down over his eye and leaned in. He examined the brush strokes, ran his fingers over the chipped mahogany, and flipped the heavy piece around to look at the back. The back was sealed tightly with thick brown craft paper that looked as though it had been glued there a century ago. After less than a minute, he pushed the painting back toward me. He sighed a sound full of professional pity. "Look, miss, the canvas is degraded. The paints are low-grade oils, and there is no signature. It's what we in the business call a Sunday painter piece. Somebody painted it in their garage for fun." "What about the frame?" I asked, desperately gripping the counter. "It's solid wood. It's incredibly heavy." "It's heavy because it's cheap, dense pine that someone stained to look like mahogany," he replied bluntly. "It's practically worthless. Tell you what, because it's pouring out there, and you look like you've had a rough week, I'll give you $20 for the wood. I can maybe repurpose it." $20. It was a lifeline. It was a hot meal. But as I looked at the painting at the stormy sea, my grandmother had stared at every single day, while her memories faded, a surge of protective anger flared in my chest. This was the only thing I had left of her. David had taken her house, her jewelry, her savings. I wasn't going to let some antique dealer chop up her favorite painting for $20. "No, thank you," I said, quietly. I grabbed the painting, ignoring the protests of my exhausted muscles, and walked back out into the freezing rain. By nightfall, desperation won out over pride. I found a seedy, neon-lit establishment off Aurora Avenue called the Starlight Motel. The manager at the front desk, a woman who looked as tired as I felt, let me trade my silver high school class ring for a single night's stay in room 114. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach, and the carpet was a questionable shade of mustard, but to me it was a palace. I immediately cranked the wall heater to its maximum setting and took a blistering, hot shower until the hot water completely ran out. Wearing clean sweatpants and feeling slightly human again, I stepped back into the main room. I had placed the painting on a rickety wooden desk near the window. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed and stared at it. I was so incredibly angry at myself. Why didn't I just take the $20, I thought? Now I have no money, no ring, and tomorrow morning I'm back in the car. I stood up to grab a towel I had left on the desk chair. As I reached past the desk, my foot caught on the frayed cord of the room's cheap floor lamp. I stumbled forward, my shoulder slamming hard into the desk. The impact violently jolted the furniture. The heavy painting tipped backward, slid off the edge of the desk and plummeted toward the floor. I lunged for it, but I was too slow. The painting crashed down directly onto the sharp, exposed metal valve of the radiator. A loud crack echoed through the small motel room, followed instantly by a sickening, prolonged sound of tearing paper and splitting wood. "No, no, no!" I gasped, dropping to my knees. The front of the canvas was miraculously unharmed, but when I flipped it over, my heart sank. The radiator valve had punched right through the thick, ancient craft paper backing, ripping a jagged foot-long gash down the center. I sat on the stained carpet, burying my face in my hands. It was the final straw. The universe was kicking me while I was down, destroying the one worthless, sentimental thing I had managed to hold on to. I reached out to inspect the damage, sliding my fingers along the torn edges of the brown paper. That's when I noticed something strange. The paper wasn't resting against the canvas. There was a gap. I pulled the torn paper back further, widening the hole. Underneath the craft paper wasn't the back of the canvas, but a thin, rigid piece of plywood. The frame had been built with a false back, creating a hidden cavity about 1/2 inch deep, and wedged tightly inside that cavity, taped to the plywood, was a thick manila envelope. My breath hitched in my throat. My hands were trembling so violently, I could barely grip the edges of the tear. I hooked my fingers under the rigid plywood and pulled. The ancient brad nails squeaked and gave way, the wood splintering as I ripped the false back completely off the frame. The envelope was heavy. It was sealed shut with a dark red wax stamp, bearing a crest I didn't recognize. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the hum of the cheap motel heater, the only sound in the room. I broke the wax seal and tipped the envelope upside down. 2 things fell into my lap. The first was a small, folded piece of stationery. I recognized the elegant, cursive handwriting immediately. It was my grandmother Beatrice's writing, but from years ago, before the tremors and the fog had taken her. "My dearest Abigail," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means my time has passed, and David's father, or David himself, has likely shown their true colors. My late husband Thomas and I always knew the boys were ruthless. We knew they would find a way to contest the primary estate and leave you with nothing. They are blind to everything but money. But they are also arrogant, and they never look beneath the surface. I leave you this painting, Abigail, not for the art, but for what anchors it. Take back what is yours, my brave girl. Make them pay." Tears blurred my vision as I set the letter down and picked up the second item. It was a brittle, yellowed document, perfectly preserved, bearing the official embossed seal of Fidelity National Title and the King County Records Office. I scanned the heavy legal text, my eyes widening with every line I comprehended. It was a property deed. But it wasn't a deed to the house I had just been evicted from. It was a deed registered exclusively in a private trust under my name, the Abigail Lawson Trust. I looked at the address of the property listed on the deed. It was a massive plot of commercial land in the heart of downtown Seattle. I knew that address. Everyone in the local real estate market knew that address. It was the multi-acre land parcel sitting directly underneath the Harrington Tower, the flagship parking complex, and corporate headquarters of my stepbrother's company, Harrington Real Estate Group. David didn't own the land his empire was built on. He leased it from a blind trust, a trust that holding this piece of paper I now controlled. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't just holding a deed. I was holding the leash to my stepbrother's entire livelihood. But as my eyes reached the bottom of the envelope, a third smaller slip of paper fluttered out. It was a heavily stamped tax delinquency notice from the city, forwarded to a P.O. box. Final notice before seizure and public auction. The trust had run out of liquid funds to pay the property taxes. If a sum of exactly $4,250 wasn't paid in full to the King County Assessor's Office by the end of the business day on Monday, exactly 48 hours from now, the state would seize the land and auction it off, wiping out the deed forever. David must have known the blind trust was defaulting. He was probably waiting to buy the land at auction for pennies on the dollar on Monday, finally securing his empire. I looked at the clock on the motel nightstand. It was Friday night. I had 2 days to come up with $4,000, or I would truly lose everything forever. Saturday and Sunday were agonizing. I was sitting on a multi-million-dollar secret, but I couldn't even afford a hot cup of coffee. I spent the weekend in a public library, taking advantage of the free heating and the internet access on their public computers. I had 48 hours to manifest $4,250 out of thin air, or the state would auction the land beneath Harrington Tower to the highest bidder, which I knew without a doubt would be my stepbrother David. I couldn't get a bank loan. I had no credit, no permanent address, and no formal income. I considered pawning my beat-up Civic, but a local mechanic laughed and told me I'd be lucky to get $800 for it in its current condition. The ticking clock was deafening. I spent hours researching Harrington Real Estate Group on the library computers, digging through public records news articles and press releases. If I couldn't borrow the money traditionally, I needed to find someone with deep pockets who hated David Harrington as much as I did. That's when I found him Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was the CEO of Pendleton, and Hayes a legacy commercial development firm in Seattle. 3 years ago, David had ruthlessly orchestrated a hostile takeover of a prime waterfront development project that Pendleton had spent a decade negotiating. The business journals described the fallout as a bloodbath of litigation, painting David as the cunning victor and Arthur Pendleton as the aging titan who had finally been outmaneuvered. Pendleton had money power and a massive axe to grind. He was my only shot. Monday morning arrived with a biting, freezing drizzle. I changed into the only clean professional clothing I had in my trash bag, a wrinkled navy blouse and black slacks. At 7:30 a.m., I parked my car 2 blocks away from the towering glass and steel headquarters of Pendleton and Hayes and walked through the rain. The lobby was a cathedral of imported Italian marble and polished brass. A severe-looking security guard eyed my damp hair and scuffed shoes, stepping into my path as I approached the elevator banks. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone indicating he intended to do the exact opposite. "I need to speak with Arthur Pendleton. It's regarding David Harrington," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Pendleton doesn't take walk-in appointments. Have a good day." He pointed a thick finger toward the revolving doors. Desperation made me bold. I saw a silver-haired man in a bespoke navy suit, flanked by 2 assistants, walking briskly toward the private executive elevator. I recognized his face from the business articles. "Mr. Pendleton," I shouted, dodging the security guard and sprinting across the slick marble floor. "Mr. Pendleton, wait!" The guard grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight, but Arthur Pendleton stopped and turned his brow furrowed in annoyance. "I know how you can take Harrington Tower," I yelled, fighting against the guard's grip. "I have the original deed to the land it sits on, and David is defaulting on it today." Pendleton stared at me. The lobby went dead silent, the only sound the hum of the elevators. He looked at my desperate rain-soaked appearance, then at the frantic gleam in my eyes. He gave a slight nod to the guard. "Let her go, Thomas." Pendleton said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "You have exactly 3 minutes to prove you aren't a lunatic. Come up to the 40th floor." 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a boardroom overlooking the Seattle skyline. Across from me sat Arthur Pendleton and his chief legal counsel, a sharp-eyed man named Gregory Dawson. I placed the yellowed brittle deed from the hidden compartment of the painting onto the mahogany table, smoothing out the edges. Gregory examined it through reading glasses, his expression shifting from skepticism to absolute shock. He typed frantically on his laptop, cross-referencing county databases. "Good God, Arthur," Gregory whispered, pushing his laptop toward his boss. "She's telling the truth. The Abigail Lawson Trust is the foundational leaseholder for the Harrington Tower parcel, and the county shows an active tax lien. It's set for public seizure at 5 p.m. today." Pendleton leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "David doesn't know you have this, does he?" "No," I replied, sitting up straight, projecting a confidence I didn't feel. "He thinks the trust's original paperwork was destroyed years ago. He is waiting for the 5 p.m. deadline to buy the lien for pennies and claim the land free and clear." "What do you want, Miss Lawson?" Pendleton asked, interlacing his fingers. "I need a cashier's check for $4,250 right now," I said firmly. "In exchange, I will grant Pendleton and Hayes a 20% equity stake in the trust's future earnings. You front the money to save the land, and you get a front-row seat to watch me destroy David's empire from the inside out." Pendleton let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. He looked at his lawyer. "Gregory, draft the equity agreement. Get this girl a check. I wouldn't miss this for the world." At 4:45 p.m., the King County Assessor's office was a dreary, fluorescent-lit purgatory filled with tired clerks and desperate taxpayers. The rain lashed against the small windows. As I walked through the double doors, the heavy Pendleton cashier's check burning a hole in my pocket, I saw him. David Harrington was leaning against the main counter, wearing a custom slate-gray suit, laughing quietly with his probate attorney, Gordon Gable. They were the only ones in the room who looked completely at ease. They were standing by the tax lien and seizure window, watching the large digital clock on the wall count down to 5 o'clock. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my damp blouse, and walked directly toward them. David noticed me when I was 10 feet away. His laughter died abruptly, replaced by a look of utter disdain. "Abigail," David scoffed, looking me up and down. "What on earth are you doing here? Did you come to beg for your old bedroom back? Or are you here to see if the county offers food stamps?" Gordon Gable chuckled, adjusting his silk tie. "We told you, Miss Lawson, the estate is settled. Harassing your brother in public won't change the court's decision." "I'm not here for the house, David," I said, my voice shockingly calm. The fear that had gripped me for the past week was completely gone, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. I stepped up to the clerk's window, cutting right in front of them. The clerk, a weary woman with thick glasses, looked up. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, loudly, making sure my voice carried across the quiet room. "I am here to pay a delinquent tax balance in full. Parcel number 8472-A. The Land Trust." David froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax mannequin. "What did you just say?" he hissed, taking a step toward me. I ignored him, sliding the manila envelope across the counter. "Here is the property deed proving my legal standing, as the sole beneficiary my identification, and a cashier's check for exactly $4,250. The clerk adjusted her glasses, examining the ancient deed. She typed the parcel number into her computer. The clicking of her keyboard sounded like gunshots in the silent room. "Ah, yes. The Abigail Lawson Trust," the clerk confirmed casually. "Payment accepted. The lien is hereby dissolved. The property remains in the trust." She brought down a heavy red stamp onto the receipt. Thud. The sound made David flinch. "That's impossible," he shouted, his professional veneer shattering completely. He slammed his hand on the counter. "That trust is dead. There is no original deed." "There was," I said, turning to face him, a terrifyingly sweet smile on my face. "Grandma Beatrice hid it in the backing of that ugly, worthless painting you were so eager to let me take to the dump. She knew exactly what kind of greedy vultures you and your father were." Gordon Gable was furiously scrolling on his phone, his hands shaking. "David, she's right. The county database just updated. The lien is cleared. She controls the land." David stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide, with a mixture of panic and fury. "You can't do this. I have a 99-year lease on that land. The tower is already built. You can't touch me." "Oh, I read the lease, David," I replied, stepping closer to him, lowering my voice so only he and his lawyer could hear. Gregory Dawson over at Pendleton, and Hayes helped me review it this afternoon. There's a fun little clause on page 42. If the blind trust ever assumes active named management, the land rent is immediately reassessed at current market value. David stopped breathing. He knew exactly what that meant. "You've been paying 1990s rates on a downtown commercial parcel for decades," I whispered. "Your new rent assessment is going up by roughly 400% effective immediately. And considering how over-leveraged your company is on your new waterfront project, I know you don't have the liquid cash to cover it." "Abigail, please," David stammered, the arrogance entirely stripped from his voice. He looked terrified. We can negotiate this. We're family. We ceased being family the moment you threw me out in the rain with $14. I said, my voice like ice. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder, slapping it hard against his chest. He reflexively grabbed it. "What is this?" he choked out. "It's a 30-day notice of rent increase," I said, turning my back and walking toward the exit. I paused at the doors and looked over my shoulder. "If you can't pay it, David, I suggest you pack your things. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my premises." What an incredible journey of sweet, poetic justice. Abigail went from being thrown out on the street with absolutely nothing to holding the keys to her cruel stepbrother's entire empire. Have you ever experienced a moment where karma hit someone perfectly? Let us know your stories in the comments below. If you loved this wild, true story of hidden family secrets and ultimate revenge, please like, share, and subscribe to our video channel for more amazing real-life dramas every week.